we're looking at perhaps a short-term charge to the property that's impacted if fees are put in place to substitute for town employees who previously did the engineering work. I'm more interested in the long-term investment. The property that we have has value both to me personally and financially because it is on the river and because it is in the wetlands. I would like to see that natural resource preserved. I don't think it can be preserved if we don't have a coherent policy and a bylaw in the correct agency to enforce it. So I would urge the body to support this warrant article.
Any further discussion? Mr. Wood.
Brian Wood, 21 Chestnut. I'd also like to expound on the fact that we are continuing to have large developments, large tracts of land that will continue to be developed with all sorts of environmental concerns and impacts. If we, the town meeting, do not appropriate the expertise for the Conservation Commission to review these plans and make validated decisions, then we are going to be at a loss in the future because these developments will come in and there will be substandard drainage and environmental impacts. The burden of proof should be placed on those developers and those proponents that come in and need a vast amount of review to be had on their projects. And so this puts the burden of proof back directly on their shoulders to be able to prove out what they say they're going to do environmentally. Thank you.
The main motion is an amendment to the general bylaws, and it therefore requires a simple majority vote. Gentleman in the aisle, please state your name and address, sir.
Scott Stimson, Swan Pond Road, member of the Conservation Commission. I'd just like to emphasize one last time a point that was made by the chairman, that the intent of this bylaw is to shift the burden. One of the intents is to shift the burden of the costs of protecting North Reading's wetlands from all the taxpayers of North Reading to the applicants who propose development within the buffer zone of our wetlands. Mr. Smith talked a bit about costs and potential costs incurred. I'd also like to remind the citizens of the costs that would be incurred to the town if we did not adequately protect our water resources. I know we've already lost one of our well sites here in town. I think that incident emphasized the need to protect our water supply. I believe at present the town pays a premium to buy water from the town of Andover. Loss of another well site to pollution and groundwater pollution would only increase the cost of the citizens of the town. Mr. Smith talked about the effects on the average homeowner. I would like to remind the citizens of the potential effects on homeowners if the quality of the water supply in their homes was not protected, if their local wetlands resources were not protected, if flood control was not adequately protected. And I think the protection of the natural resources in this town, in terms of wetland resources, watershed areas, only enhances the property values of the citizens of this town. Thank you.
Mrs. Cerrone.
A couple of years ago, we did a survey, and water was the #1 priority by all of those that responded. And we see this as one more step in a process of a series of steps of protection of our water and the source of our water, and the selectmen recommend.
Mrs. Richards. Motion is to terminate debate on the question. All those in favor of terminating debate, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Unanimous. On the main motion under Article 19, which requires a simple majority, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The chair is in doubt. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. And Mr. Quayle, Mrs. Richards, and Mr. Wood, please count the vote. Mrs. Richards? 8. Mr. Wood?
15.
15. Mr. Quayle? 32. 32. All those opposed, please raise your right hand. Mr. Wood?
3.
3. Ms. Richards? 16. Mr. Quayle? 10. The vote is 55 in favor, 29 opposed. The motion is carried. Article 20. Mr. Weiss.
I move to authorize under Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 44, Section 53E and a half, the establishment of a conservation revolving fund as specified in Article 20 as printed in the warrant.
Heard the motion. Does the Finance Committee have a recommendation? Mrs. Holsing.
Mr. Moderator, we need a clarification. Where is it coming from?
The motion is to authorize under Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 53E and a half, the establishment of a conservation revolving fund as specified in Article 20 of the warrant. And Article 20 of the warrant specifies, and you all have it in front of you, fees and other payments collected under Section 16.4 of the General Wetlands Protection Bylaw shall be deposited for use by the Conservation Commission to pay administrative, engineering, inspection, and enforcement costs associated with its administration of said bylaw.
20.
Now, the motion does not refer to the further authorization of the expenditure of not more than $100,000. Therefore, the chair would interpret the motion not to request that authorization. In other words, the motion before us is merely to establish the fund, but not to authorize the expenditure. Is that your intent, Mr. Weiss?
No.
Mr. Weiss, is that your intent? The motion before the meeting as it stands right now, ladies and gentlemen, proposes to establish the Conservation Revolving Fund. It does not propose to authorize any expenditures from that fund. It would be cleaner to have an amendment.
And to authorize expenditure of not more than 100,000. All right, 20.
Is there an amendment, Mrs. Holsing?
Yes, there is. Mr. Moderator, I move to amend Article 20 as follows: to raise and appropriate the sum of $10,000 to start the fund and to authorize the expenditure of not more than $100,000.
Okay, now the chair will have to check whether this is within the four corners of the article, and the chair does find that it is within the four corners of the article. The motion to amend is a motion to raise and appropriate, in addition to what's proposed by the main motion, to raise and appropriate the sum of $10,000 to start the fund and to authorize the expenditure of not more than $100,000. Is that the recommendation of the Finance Committee? Okay. Now, on the motion, Mr. Mocheri.
Bob Messeri, 11 Susan Drive.
Just a moment, Mr. Mocheri. The chair will allow discussion both on the main motion and the motion to amend. I believe that this will expedite the course of the meeting. Mr. Mocheri.
My question is to the Finance Committee. I think I just heard that motion to be raise and appropriate. What does that do to balancing our budget?
Mrs. Holsing.
We took this into account when we were balancing the budget, and in the previous vote, which we had originally had raise and appropriate, we had moved it from stabilization. So this does nothing to affect the balancing of the budget. Is in balance.
Any further discussion? Mrs. Norris.
Diane Norris, 240 Elm Street. This is a question on the cap of $100,000 in expenditure from the fund. Does that mean annually, forever? What's the $100,000 cap?
Would the Finance Committee be able to answer Mrs. Norris's question? There had been a question as to whether this authorization is valid for 1 year or for infinity.
It's for 1 year, and it has to be repeated annually. The $100,000, by the way, was a number that was selected in order to put a ceiling on it that would probably not be reached in order that it wasn't too low.
Mr. O'Brien.
That expenditure be allowed for no more than 1 year?
Covered by statute. That's the way the law reads, Mr. O'Brien. That's the way the law reads. It has to be that it can only be done annually, not in perpetuity.
I'm in sympathy with what Mr. Norris said.
Any further discussion? Mr. Pasquale.
John Pasquale, 12 Hickory Lane. I have nothing against the money. It's like, I want to know who's going to control it from an accounting standpoint. Is it the accounting department down at Town Hall? Or is it, quote, the members of this committee? You know, who's going to control this money?
Mr. Daly.
The accounting of the revolving fund and the use of the revolving fund and the control over it not exceeding the $100,000 cap will be handled by the Finance Department. The administration of the fund, the taking in of money, the spending of money will be handled by the Conservation Commission.
Mr. Quayle.
Phil Quayle, 5 Williams Road. Will at any time the monies that are being taken in as fees on this go into the general fund?
No.
Then potentially there could be up to $100,000 completely at the discretion of this one individual group, and the town would never realize any benefit from it, that is monetary benefit.
Let me make sure I give you an accurate answer here.
Mrs. Belmonte.
This is a revolving fund, and the fees that they charge will go into this fund.